Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? Well, I'm at home waiting for a pellet stove to be delivered. It's supposed to be delivered sometime between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. It's 10:45, so that means as soon as I start this, it should show up, and I'm going to have to stop this. But I wanted to talk about a subject that's come up in this discussion group I've been involved in, and I've kind of talked about it a little bit before, or started to alluding to that because this is kind of the discussion we've been having. It's gotten bigger. And I want to talk about subjectivity versus objectivity as you approach role-playing games. And, I made a couple of videos talking about, rewards versus, incentivizing certain types of play versus just doing it because you like doing it. But I want to look at, we'll talk a little bit about incentivization and kind of broaden it a little bit. Because as these are great discussions we've been having. But one of the members of the group, this guy Brian, has been leaning a lot more towards objective criteria for things like advancement or things like handing out an in-game currency, and actually did this great job of really tearing apart a whole bunch of different games, looking at a whole bunch of different reward structures, incentivization structures, how the game is actually what the guts of the game are and how it really works. It's really, really cool. And as I'm looking at all this, as we're talking, I kind of quip the idea that the older I've gotten, the more comfortable I've become, or the more I prefer things to be a little bit more subjective, as opposed to being really rigid and really objective. It probably isn't very surprising to somebody that watches my channel that that's kind of my bent. I like to have a framework, but I like there to be some room for interpretation. And actually, Jason, Dark Age of Roleplay Game, really clued me into one thing I hadn't thought of. And he said I think it might have been Brian, but maybe it was Brian. But he mentioned the idea that of course that makes sense because the older you've become, the more experienced you become. It's not really a function of age, but of experience. You're much better at figuring this stuff out. You've kind of learned the best practices for games. You know kind of how to feel this sort of thing out. But for the newer players at the table, they haven't figured this sort of stuff out yet. It's one of the interesting things as I've been examining a bunch of games, a lot of indie games, over and over again. There are games which have formalized what a lot of us used as kind of best practices back in the day. Who gets to decide what was the best practice? We don't always agree on what this best practice was, but there are certain parts of like games powered by the apocalypse which they do things specifically. If you look at them closely, it kind of mimics what a lot of us used to do. It just makes it a formal structure now. Doesn't mean we all agree on doing it that way, but it really kind of interesting. And so, in a way, that kind of provides a framework and kind of provides an objective criteria for some things that we used to do subjectively, or tells you to be subjective here, if that makes any kind of sense. But one of the things that I found really fascinating, the more we've looked at this and talked about it, is that these role-playing games that we play, that we're so enamored with, they're kind of like this neutral zone between like a tabletop board game that has just very rigid rules. You're playing Risk, you're playing Monopoly, you're playing Sorry, you're playing whatever it is, Chutes and Ladders, which is very, very defined, and like a kind of a free-form improv on the other end of the spectrum. And somewhere in the middle of these role-playing games, and absolutely the game, as Anthony pointed out, the game itself, the system itself defines how we're going to play it. It's going to define the techniques. It's going to define, it's going to limit it's a limiting factor in the techniques we're going to use, and how we're, how objective or subjective we're going to be. Even so, I believe it really, at a certain point, it becomes the person actually using it. There's the human factor is always a big limiting factor, or not limiting factor, but it's, you can't really take that out of the games, which I personally like. It's my experience that the right person can take the most rigid framework in a game and bring it to life and make it a really enjoyable, living, breathing, dynamic game. And by the same token, the right person can take interject like order and sensibility into the most abstract framework. And we've all seen games like that which are on the other ends of the spectrum. The right person can kind of take them and crystallize them one way or the other, or loosen them up, so to speak. And one of the questions I thought as we were having this discussion was and I was playing devil's advocate quite a bit, is when do you stop clarifying things and let interpretation take over? And one of the examples that I believe Brian had put out before was he was taking something like in a game like games powered by Ubiquity. I believe it was All for One Regime Diabolique. He was talking about the idea that in the game you will find various descriptions of what a different skill level is, depending on how many skill points or what your skill rank is at the end of the day, your ability score plus however many points you put in that skill, and it will tell you that, like, a rating of 0 to 1 is just abysmal, and something like whatever it happens to be, all the way up to, like, say, 10 or 12 or 14, where you're world class or an expert. And he talked about the idea of putting some additional descriptors on there, where you talk about being something like a novice and a journeyman, and somebody that's finally like an expert or world class, and kind of having some definitions for what does that really mean. And playing devil's advocate, I would say, okay, well, at some point you'd say, well, we have to define this a little bit further, and then you have to define, well, what does a journeyman in stealth really look like, and what are the defining characteristics of that? And then and then go farther and farther down that rabbit hole. At what point in a game do you? And so now we're no longer talking about reinforcing behaviors. Or we're talking about and deciding, like, objectively or subjectively, what's good role play? You did good role playing today. What does that mean? We're no longer talking about that in terms of giving a reward at the end of the game or in the middle of the game. Now we're talking about, like, how do you actually define what these skills are? Every single game on my shelf in some way, shape, or form gives me a framework and seeks to at least sort of define certain things in the game. At some point they leave off. The granularity, the fineness of definition stops, and then you have to make it up. You have to interpret it. Sometimes it can be a matter of preference or comfortability, where that lies. I certainly enjoy some games where it becomes very, very defined, especially if it's about something I know nothing about. But for a person like me, not surprising, I like a bit of abstraction where we can kind of make that stuff up. But I also realize that has come with experience. Sometimes what you and I do, if we've been doing this for a while, is not necessarily duplicatable by the guy that just picked it up. They need somebody to teach them, or they need the game itself to teach them. So that becomes kind of a conundrum. How do you teach the brand new person, as in the text, writing a game, without making it too prescriptive, without making it so objective that it becomes very mechanical? I don't know if that makes any sense to you, but it makes sense to me. Really, really interesting stuff. And eventually, at the end of the day, we talk about techniques. And one of the things that Jason, Dark Age of Roleplay game, brought up, which is kind of tangential to that, which I thought was great, was he talked about the time lag between a behavior and a reward. In other words, the immediacy. Like, do you give out like style points right away when somebody does good role playing or whatever it is they do? You get this in-game currency right away, versus something like experience points, which tend to be handed out at the end of a session. And one of the things, I used to be involved in behavior modification as a career, and one of the first things that you learn is that the immediacy, the sooner you reinforce or punish, reward or punish a particular behavior, whatever it is, then the more likely you are to increase or decrease that behavior, as the case may be. The longer you wait to administer that reward or punishment for this targeted behavior, whether it's something you want to increase or decrease, the less effective that is on promoting or discouraging that behavior. And the idea that maybe we should hand out experience in the middle of the game for something particularly awesome. But once again, how do we make it so we're not just teaching people to jump through hoops, like dogs doing tricks? And of course, getting back to the original thesis that Brian was putting out there, or a concept that Brian was putting out there, it's a really fine line you have to walk between just subjectively deciding what good role play is, or whatever it happens to be, versus having some kind of objective criteria. To me, I think that boils down a lot to some maturity and experience, and discussing with each other beforehand. What do we mean by role play? Actually, Jason did a great job in a follow-up conversation about that. Really, a kind of, does the game itself define role play, or whatever it happens to be, whatever behaviors we're going to reward or incentivize or otherwise hope to promote? Or do we as a group sit down and discuss, what kind of game experience are we looking for here? What are we going to want to encourage? Whether it's something like role play, or talking in the first person, or talking in the third person and narrating what our character does, etc. Big subject. But I don't think you can be fully objective, nor do I think you can be fully subjective. Somewhere in the middle, there's a sweet spot. But for each one of us, it varies. That's become very manifest to me. So what do you think about all that? Does that make sense, or am I crazy?